All right, good evening, welcome. We just finished our annual meeting. Thank you for attending tonight's speaker series talk given by Dr. Dianne Roman. On behalf of Historic Shepherdstown Commission, I am going to turn this over to the chair of our Program and Awards Committee, Dave Pugh, who will provide the formal introduction for Dianne.
Thank you for everyone who has been present for the meeting and who has just joined us. For everyone to know, I am leaving the board for 6 years, as Donna has mentioned, and to smooth that transition, I have no video of myself this evening, so I won't be missed as severely.
Okay.
Good evening, and thanks for zooming in for Historic Shepherdstown and Entler Museum's third of 4 2021 Speaker Series programs. As you now know, I'm Dave Pugh, chair of the program committee. At this time, I would like to welcome Dr. Dianne Roman, our featured speaker, who will explore the story of John S. Gallaher, a young local newspaper man who, in 1824, successfully started a women's magazine in Jefferson County. What was his incentive for this publication, and what did he print? The presentation will examine Gallaher's early career for possible clues, the variety of materials published, and consider several options for its termination after 4 years. A question and answer session will follow using your chat function. Also, if you would please, to enhance our Wi-Fi connection, mute your device and turn off the video at this time. Thanks. Dr. Dianne Roman is a graphic designer and print historian. She received her master's degree in fine arts from the Massachusetts College of Arts in Boston and her PhD in media, art, and text from Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. Her dissertation identified several previously unknown women who were actively involved in the 19th century printing and publishing industry. She has taught graphic design on the academic level in both West Virginia and Massachusetts, as well as maintained a studio and research practice. A Jefferson County resident since 1997, she is renovating a 200-year-old stone cottage in her spare time. Now, speaking on the subject of John S. Gallaher, the Ladies' Garland, the story of an 1820s Jefferson County women's magazine, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Dianne Roman.
All right. Thank you all for coming. I just found out today that today is International Literacy Day of all days, so it's a good day to talk about a women's magazine. I want to thank you all for coming, and I do want to thank Historic Shepherdstown for inviting me. I think it's a true honor, and I'm thrilled to death. A few quick notes. I am not Winston Churchill, so I will read my paper instead of just telling it to you. And as you know, it's about John Gallaher, his women's magazine, The Ladies' Garland. It was published in Harper's Ferry in the early 1820s. And although that particular publication was published in Harper's Ferry, tonight's talk will actually begin in Shepherdstown. But to begin with, I thought I would run through really quickly a few of the abbreviations that you'll see in my slides because of their length. WVRHC stands for West Virginia and Regional History Center. It's in Morgantown, West Virginia. LOC is the Library of Congress. They are in DC. JCM is the Jefferson County Museum Collection. And Portal is the Portal to Texas History, University of Northern Texas Libraries. I know that seems kind of strange, but they have a digital newspaper archive, which I use. And sadly, though, some of, or probably most of the images you will see tonight are actually from microfilm, and you will know them immediately. But first, let me start off by introducing you to John S. Gallaher. He was born in Martinsburg, Virginia on December 1st, 1796, a time before Jefferson County or the state of West Virginia existed. Officially, he began his journalistic career as an apprentice under John Albertus in 1809 at the age of 12. In order to arrive at his entry, though, into the field of printing, I feel I should give you some background into printing and a few key individuals of importance. 1796 is actually only 6 years into the duration of printing in Northern Virginia, this whole area. I already lost my place. The first business, the first printing business that we know of that started in the British colonies was in 1638 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. You would think with Jamestown, Virginia, as the first permanent British colony dating 1607, you would think printing would come early to Virginia, but it did not. Some of you may be familiar with the well-known and often cited statement of the Royal Governor of Virginia, Sir William Beckley, "I thank God we have not free schools nor printing, and I hope we shall not have these 100 years." Berkeley considered these two institutions instruments of disobedience and hearsay against organized government and was against them. There was a scant attempt at printing in Virginia around 1681. It was quickly extinguished. In 1729, we know that a William Parks was printing for the colony of Virginia, but he actually lived in Maryland. He would not move to Virginia until 1733, and that would be into Williamsburg. A second printer, William and Clementine, it's a husband-wife combination, did not appear in Virginia until 1766, again in Williamsburg. So with a slow start in a populated area, it is not surprising that printing did not come to Northern Virginia until 1790. In 1790, Nathaniel Willis, a Boston printer, came to Shepherdstown. He set up the first press, and he printed the first newspaper in the area, the Potomac Guardian and Berkeley Advertiser, beginning in November. Willis would only stay in Shepherdstown a couple years. He would move on to Martinsburg somewhere between 1792 and 1793. By 1798, he changed the name to Potomac Guardian, and by 1800, he had discontinued it completely and moved on to another state. In 1953, in an article titled West Virginia Printers and Their Work, Otis Rice thought that John Albertus might have been Willis's apprentice or his assistant in Martinsburg. In a 1959 article in the Martinsburg Journal, Clifford Musser questioned where Albertus was born, citing Richmond, Baltimore, or Massachusetts, all as possibilities, with Musser concluding Albertus may have come to Shepherdstown with Willis. As yet, I have found no information on when or why the Albertus family moved to the Martinsburg area. I have found no evidence that Willis ever stopped in Baltimore on his travels from Boston. I do know that Willis went from Boston to Winchester, Virginia, where he printed beginning in 1787 before coming to Shepherdstown. So there's a variety of ideas and speculations about Albertus and his initial involvement in printing, with little information to substantiate any claims. In my genealogical research, I have found that John Albertus's date of birth was the 23rd of August, 1778, in Independent City, Maryland, which is Baltimore. Serendipitously, during COVID, of all things, a small, untitled, and unauthored diary was offered to Wayne Goodrich. Upon reading through it, one becomes aware it is most likely the diary of John Albertus. It begins on his 21st birthday. Although it was not maintained daily, he cited August 23rd as his birthday. He locates himself in Martinsburg and working for a printer. Scattered across the pages are some of his trials with his employer and his difficulties in obtaining his pay. Albertus considered Mr. W, or Mr. Willis, as he refers to him, as having a callous heart. His entry for October 18th, 1798 reads as follows: 3 months from this day will complete the period I am destined to serve Mr. W. With the most flattering prospects, I anticipate its expirations, not so much on account of wages being augmented, though I must acknowledge that to have its influence, as pleasing idea of being out of the power of a man I have had sufficient reason to detest. These sentiments during the expired times have been the most base and unmanly, without any cause other than that of being too attentive. 3 months after this entry would be January 18th, 1799. As yet, I have found no indenture document for Albertus, but subtracting 18, an average age for an apprenticeship at this time, would take us to 1791, when Willis was setting up and running his shop in Shepherdstown, or 1792-93 after he moved to Martinsburg. Albertus would have been between 12 and 13, a common age to begin an apprenticeship. Connections within the printing community most likely brought Albertus to Willis. It is possible that Willis knew of Albertus as a potential apprentice from contacts in Massachusetts, as I am aware that the Albertus family did have connections there. Albertus did leave Williams in 1799, setting up his own shop and launching the Berkeley Intelligencer on April 3rd of that year. I imagine those most flattering prospects Albertus referred to in his diary might have been financial supporters for a new printer. Albertus was politically sympathetic to the Federalist opinion, in complete opposition to Willis's Jeffersonian stance. According to Rice, within 6 months, Albertus's Intelligencer had achieved a greater circulation than Willis's Guardian. 10 years into his printing business, 1809, Albertus would marry a Nancy Van Meter and later take on a 12-year-old John Gallaher as his apprentice. Albertus's time as an apprentice under Willis must have taught him a lot about how not to treat an apprentice. Under Albertus's tutelage, Gallaher would learn the trade, be given opportunities, build a lasting relationship between both him and John and Nancy. In 1809, Albertus's paper officially was called the Berkeley and Jefferson Intelligencer. In 1810, he changed the name to the Martinsburg Gazette. Gallaher began his training on April 4th with the Berkeley Intelligencer. A seed for a magazine, Women as an Audience. In the July 27th, 1810 issue of the Martinsburg Gazette, one finds a proposal for a literary miscellany, a monthly magazine Albertus hoped to produce. The prospectus for the miscellany alludes to the newly emerging female audience as a focus. Having been involved with printing for at least 12 years on his own, why now, at the age of 32, would Albertus become interested in the needs of the females in his community enough to want to produce a monthly publication for them? I cannot help but believe his wife was instrumental in this decision. Gallaher had been in the shop a little over a year by now, and most likely helped set some or all of the text for this article, as well as the rest of the paper. The literary miscellany never came to life. Whether Albertus changed his mind or did not obtain the desired 500 subscriptions is unknown. Today we are at a critical juncture with media publications. Should one produce or consume a physically printed one or a digital one? Some publications, such as the New Yorker, offer consumers subscriptions to either version or a hybrid combination of both. With so many choices for consumption and a wide variety of items available, we often take publications for granted and not consider their history. The production of newspapers can be traced to the early 17th century in Germany. The first one to appear in the colonies was edited by the Boston postmaster and bookseller John Campbell and printed by Bartholomew Green in Boston in 1704 under the banner, the Boston Newsletter. The magazine, as a specifically designated item, made its debut in London in 1731. A gentleman's magazine, produced by Edward Cove, took its name from the French term magasin, which means storehouse, referring to the collection of items which composed its contents. The magazine would not arrive in America until 1741. The first two were published within 3 days of each other in Philadelphia. Ben Franklin's General Magazine was eclipsed by Andrew Bradford's American Magazine. Like many successors to follow, Bradford's and Franklin's magazines' lifespans were short, 3 and 6 months respectively. This short lifespan of the early magazine was the result of a lack of enthusiasm by the readers, followed closely by the indifference of the contributors. Early magazines were designated as such due to their content, an eclectic assortment of items having no association with the format. They were also intended to be bound, either at the time of publication or collected at the end of a designated time frame and bound together. In many cases, they were nothing more than a single or half sheet of paper printed on both sides. If folded once, it resulted into a 4-page folio similar to a newspaper. Newspapers, however, had no consideration for binding. Although included as a general reader, it was not until 1784 that American publishers embraced women as an audience to target. The first publication written exclusively for women was the Ladies' Magazine and Repository of Entertaining Knowledge in 1792. William Gibbons in Philadelphia was the publisher, but the frontispiece clearly states it was by a literary society, perhaps the Ladies of Philadelphia, which the introductory announcement mentions. Like most magazines of its day, its lifespan was less than a year. The first magazine published by a female was the Intellectual Regale, or the Ladies' Tea Tray, from 1814 to 1815 by Mary Clark Carr, also in Philadelphia. The Tea Tray barely survived its first year. The most popular and widely distributed early women's magazine was Philadelphian Louis Goody's Ladies' Book from 1830 to 1878, of which Sarah Josepha Hale was the editor. Gallaher's Garland was published between Clark, Carr, and Goody. It should not be confused with another Ladies' Garland, a journal published in Philadelphia by J. Libby beginning in 1837. 1810, the year Albertus proposed his literary miscellany, was still early in the life of the American magazine. By the end of the 18th century, only about 42 magazines had been attempted, and most with a lifespan of less than a year. However, by the end of the first quarter of the 19th century, the weekly magazine had been introduced across the nation in many towns and cities. Albertus was obviously paying attention to the trends in publishing and making an effort to be out in front, while Gallaher was working alongside and learning. So what did Gallaher do between his apprenticeship and debuting the Garland? Upon entering the political arena in 1830 as an elected member of the House of Delegates, John Gallaher's career has been marginally maintained, but his early years in newspapering are sketchy. What is available is lacking in detail and sometimes contradictory. Prior to his 18th birthday, Gallaher, with about 5 full years of working experience under Albertus, stepped into the role of managing editor for the Charlestown Farmers Repository. Although the dates for Gallaher's involvement with the repository are unclear, working with military records from the War of 1812, I can establish that he was there from at least March through May of 1814. Richard Williams, the editor and printer of the repository, was a second lieutenant in Captain Joseph Grantham's Company of Light Infantry of Jefferson County. A company of the 55th Virginia Regiment, Grantham's unit was called into service on March 31st, 1814. Of the various sub-companies of the 55th, Williams was probably involved with the detachment led by Lieutenant Braxton Davenport, actively engaged from April 20th through May 10th of that year. John Gallaher would have most likely begun working in Williams' shop at the beginning of March in order to establish himself there. The actuality or plans for this may have begun sooner, as Albertus began running an ad for Gallaher's replacement on February 7th, 1814 in the Martinsburg Gazette. For a 17-year-old, managing a weekly newspaper would have been a major responsibility, requiring confidence and great skill on Gallaher's part, as well as the faith of both Williams and Albertus. Following Williams' return to the repository, how long did Gallaher remain there? Throughout the time Gallaher ran the shop, the only mention of him doing so was in a short notice requesting subscribers to pay up their bills, as the editor had been called up for service and a suitable person had been engaged to superintend the business during the absence. The masthead continued to carry Williams' name as the printer, and the overall look of the paper remained the same. Gallaher was probably there and may have set the type for the Thursday, June 9, 1814 article calling the young men of Jefferson County to volunteer in a rifle company. The initial meeting was to be held on the fourth Saturday in June. It is not known if Gallaher attended this meeting, but join a Jefferson County rifle company he did. He was a member of Captain George W. Humphrey's Riflemen and was actively engaged between August 26th through September 8th. It is known that his unit was involved with the Battle of the White House. If he had returned to Martinsburg to work for Albertus, he may have joined the Berkeley County 67th Regiment, like Albertus had been involved with earlier. Following his contribution with the rifle company, Gallaher did return to Martinsburg and the Gazette in the position of foreman. It is unknown how long he remained working for Albertus. At this point, things get sketchy. William Evans, in his History of Berkeley County, claimed that Gallaher worked for a period of time at the National Intelligencer in Washington, D.C., in addition to some involvement in Baltimore at Niles Register. No dates of employment were given for either. John Gallaher can be placed as living in Washington City, D.C. at the time of his marriage to Catherine Shannon on September 7, 1817. Both he and Catherine listed District of Columbia as their place of residence. Their first child, John Jr., was also born in Washington City in 1818. John Sr.'s obituary in the Stoughton Spectator of February 13, 1877, states that he was employed as a journeyman at the Intelligencer after the War of 1812, as well as one of their leading journalists for several years. Gallaher was most likely in Washington from about 1816 to 1821 and employed at the Intelligencer during this time. His time in Baltimore may have been between 1815 and 1816. A master printer. By 1821, we know that Gallaher, married, a father, age 25, had moved to Harper's Ferry and opened a print shop with his brother and a nephew. They launched the first newspaper in Harper's Ferry, initially titled the Free Press, later renamed the Harper's Ferry Free Press, on June 13th of that year. No information on Gallaher's Harper's Ferry shop has been found. Currently on display at the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley in Winchester, Virginia, is a wonderful example of 1810 state-of-the-art printing technology in the actual wooden hand press and various items used by the Henkel family of Winchester. They produced the German newsletter in the early 1800s. As an apprentice under Albertus, and while assisting at the Farmers Repository, Gallaher would have worked on a press like the Henkels, such as this wooden hand press. In his travels, this remained the mainstay press until the early 1820s. Although the iron press had been developed in England at the turn of the 19th century, and an ornately decorative one was created in 1813 in Philadelphia, it would be around 1820, 1821 before a modest iron hand press like this one would become the workhorse in the American newspaper industry. The National Intelligencer, a progressive and successful shop, most likely moved to iron early on. While at the Intelligencer, Gallaher was probably exposed to one. I have no doubt that when he set up his own shop in Harper's Ferry, it included an iron press as early as possible. By 1821, in addition to 12 years of printing experience, Gallaher had established himself in the surrounding printing community. From Albertus, he had learned the mechanics of the trade. In Charlestown, Williams and the Farmers Repository had depended on his skill and youthful maturity during the War of 1812. Whatever Gallaher's involvement at Niles Register was, it would have introduced him to Hezekiah Niles, a progressive printer with early magazine interests, as well as the ability to maintain a political balance with his readers. Gallaher's involvement with the National Intelligencer was likely at a pivotal moment when the paper transitioned from a tri-weekly to a daily. It was the primary source for news on Capitol Hill from Jefferson's presidency through that of Monroe's, and would have provided Gallaher with a solid foundation in political writing. From 1821 to 1824, Gallaher's shop produced the Harper's Ferry Free Press, So far, I have found no other information as far as other products he may have produced. Prior to establishing himself as a master printer in Harper's Ferry, Gallaher had worked on newspapers established by others. The overall look and feel of these papers, as well as their politics or mission, was established by someone else. With the Free Press, Gallaher had an opportunity to set up his own example. Of the three papers I know that he was employed with, it was the Gazettes and the repository's architecture he most closely followed. Both used horizontal bars to set off titles that were hand set in all caps in a Roman style font. Below the title and bar was the date and issue information, followed by another horizontal bar. Below this, there were three thin vertical lines, equally dividing the page into 4 equal texts for columns. The Intelligencer had 5 text columns. Like the Gazette, the publisher information was housed in the left column at the top. The repository provided its location and printer information just below the title, where Gallaher added a slogan instead. In 1811, Albertus modified his masthead by eliminating one set of horizontal bars below the title in exchange for a wavy line. Gallaher followed this example, except he used a thin, thick line combination. Both the Gazette and the Free Press would include advertisements. But the Garland was different. Half the size of the Free Press, it measured about 9.5 by 12. Utilizing half a sheet of the same paper as the Free Press, the Roman font used for the title was changed to Old English. Only the essential information appeared at the top, and one column of text was removed. Unlike the Free Press, not a single advertisement would ever appear on any page. The Garland debuted on Saturday, February 14, 1824, as if a Valentine for the women of Harper's Ferry and surrounding areas. Although there was no mention of Valentine's Day in the publication, it was a widely known and occasionally celebrated custom in the 19th century America. The Garland was simply a token of affection and admiration for the female sex. From February 14, 1824, it ran until June 7, 1828, a 4-year run. It is considered one of the earliest literary magazines in the United States devoted to the interests of women. Gallaher's Garland was concerned with providing women with material for thought and improvement. Similar to other miscellaneous publications that began to appear, it included a variety of materials from poetry, sentimental moral tales, travel sketches, and notes on history. Women's improvement as well as fashions were included. On the front page of the first issue began with an introduction in which Gallaher dedicated the paper to the ladies. This 1.5 column introduction claimed to reiterate the prospectus to develop a publication for women with hopes of exciting in their minds a spirit of emulation and a taste for the cultivation of literature. He goes on to say that such a task would really benefit from an individual of better skills. He used the term abler head. Since no such individual came forward, he and his colleagues, an unidentified we, stepped up to this challenge with diffidence, it is true, but not without cheerfulness. Commenting on his youthfulness and that of the staff, he assured the audience this publication would not attempt to direct the taste of women. Instead, the hope was to be a publication that entertained. However, he further claimed that due to his gratitude for the females' manifold kindness and tender assiduities, the Garland would occasionally spread before them precepts for their government, examples for their imitation, and models for their improvement. This was followed by encouraging the readers to submit original contributions. A final note embraced the potential readership of both men and women. Although devoted to the ladies, men were encouraged to contribute as well. The remainder of the first page and the first 2 columns on page 2 offered a description of the Harper's Ferry area. This was provided so that the distant reader would be knowledgeable of a chaotic mass of the area, where rocks are inaccessible and summits that tire the eagle's wings. He reminded the reader that Harper's Ferry was the location of Thomas Jefferson's statement, worth a voyage across the Atlantic. The specific location, Jefferson Rock, in 1824 was still a subject of inquiry and examination by every visitor. The top of column 3 on page 2 informed the reader of the intention of collecting and binding together all the issues from the first year in a convenient volume, thus clarifying the Garland's magazine status. Just below, under the subtitle Literary Intelligence, 2 publications were advertised. The first, Margaret Baynard Smith's novel, A Winter in Washington, was followed by noting that the recent publication, The Pilot, was already in its 2nd edition with over 3,000 copies sold. The author was only identified by his previous works, The Spy and The Pioneer. Of course, the intended audience of the Garland would already know these were the works of J. Fenimore Cooper, so his name would not need to be mentioned. The remainder of the page had a few lines of verse and a short note as filler. The 3 subheadings on page 3, the repository, biography, and education, were filled with moral tales, information on Lady Rachel Russell's, a 17th century English noblewoman who displayed noble, pious resignation and religious deportment during her husband's trial and execution, and a Reverend Bennett's opinion on women and their education. Page 4 began with the category The Medley, a perfect subtitle for the collection of anecdotes that followed. The remaining 2 columns were filled with poetry, thus travel, sentimental and moral tales, biography, opinion on female education, anecdotal information, items, and verse provided the content of the inaugural issue. The second issue began with a romantic description of Niagara Falls, followed by a piece discussing soldiers at war while their mothers were in church. A second page was a moral tale, and page 3 an eclectic assortment of items ranging from a light-hearted look at funeral customs in Italy, a story on Alexander the Great's honorable treatment of his captive, the defeated King Darius's queen, and a female's contribution on a variety of blunders single men exhibited that resulted in their reduced marriageability. Issue 3 began with a letter to Mr. Gallaher from a reader designated as the Rambler. Upon reading in the first issue Gallaher's picturesque description of a local landscape and the beautiful final resting place for loved ones of the past, this reader reflected on how the trials of life prepare us for the enjoyment of repose and the joys of immortality. The second page was devoted to a tale of war. Page 3 was divided into 3 topics: the casket, the portrait, and the garland. The broader definition of casket, a small ornamental box or chest for holding gems and valuables, seems appropriate here. Under casket was a reprinted item from the publication The Hermit in London. Under portrait was a not so flattering description of West India females, but under the category The Garland was the mention of a recently read prospectus of a soon-to-be published paper titled The Western Lady's Casket, to be edited by a woman. Compliments and wishes for success followed as the Garland hailed with delight every effort to develop the true dignity and worth of woman. Issue 4 began with travel notes on Ireland. The second page was covered with a story of love, rejection, and forgiveness. On page 3, under the heading The Garland, we learn of the popularity of the publication. The Garland had met with such success that Gallaher had to reprint the first 3 issues to meet demands. What did this really mean? Were all 3 issues reset, all the type by hand? This would have been a monumental task, as here the 4th issue was out and his weekly free press had been published. Although stereotyping had been introduced in America by 1813, I cannot actually believe that Gallaher had at the onset any of the pages of the Garland stereotyped. Items expecting to be in great demand, such as the Bible, were stereotyped, but a small town ephemera miscellanea for women would not garner such an expense. Handset, I am sure they were. He concluded that he would be finished with the reprints within the forthcoming week. This was followed by a request that all future correspondence be sent in anonymously in order to allow the staff of the Garland to be impartial and unbiased in the publication continue to grow. Although Although both issues 5 and 6 continued with the front page containing a variety of items, issue 7's front page was almost completely covered by a short story reprinted from the Trenton Emporium. Issue 8 carried a similar reprint, and by issue 9, the front page was completely covered by a story that continued on to page 2 with "to be continued" as the final line. The serialized story then became the standard format of the Garland. Some of these stories were only 2 issues long, others 3 and 4, such as this 3-part story, Theodore Roland, A Tale of a 10-Year-Old Lad, that appeared in March of 1825. Most of these stories were either moral or sentimental tales, often a combination of bittersweet and educational. The generalized topics were tales of hardship in life, fallen women or lovers, unexpected changes in one's fortune, and the expectation of a better hereafter. The 4th page usually contained the poetry section, and there were frequently at least one piece written for the Garland. Pages 2 and 3 were left to exhibit the greatest variety. Although the category headings varied, reflecting the selection of material in that issue, the most frequently used categories were the mirror, the monitor, portrait or portraiture, the toilet, and variety, along with the Garland, in which general information about the publication, or specific information to the reader was provided. Within these 2 pages, one learned about customs in various countries, the fate of females abducted and sold into slavery, the conjugal affections of Native Americans, Aborigines, and local folk, what the life of a Russian princess was like, and a variety of biographical sketches of individuals, such as Queen Elizabeth, the first that is, Joan of Arc, Madame de la Fonte, General Lee, and Anne Boleyn. I am sure some of you may be thinking, toilet seems like an inappropriate and odd term for a ladies' magazine. Toilette is possibly a better choice. But in early 19th century vernacular, the term toilet was more aligned to a sense of grooming than a physical location. It had evolved from the French term toile that referred to a small piece of cloth, usually placed over the shoulders before one did their hair or shaving. Although the toilet was more frequently used, the casket was occasionally in its place, both assisting women with the principles of female costume, the latest fashions in evening and walking dress, as well as head garments, the deleterious effects of wearing a corset. Cautionary advice was also provided on such subjects as the power of beauty, the snare of personal beauty, and the risk of giving advice, the loss of friendship. Unlike the first 3 volumes, Volume 4 did not appear the second week in February. Its appearance on Saturday, May 19, 1827, followed the established format of a reprinted story covering the first and second pages. On page 3, under the Garland, Mr. Gallaher explained the lateness of the issue. He had hoped to expand the format of the paper. Due to an unexplained events that prevented this expansion, he returned to the original format. Mentioning that the Garland had produced no profit, he was nevertheless flattered by its support that it had earned. He went on to state that when he began the Garland, there were only 2 that he knew of similar publications. 3 years later, there were no less than 10, clearly indicating the growth of the female audience in literature. Thankful to his patrons, he again pledged himself to the liberality and kindness of the public. 50 issues later, the May 31st, 1828 issue, Gallaher announced to discontinue the publication. He did not actually state he was discontinuing the Garland, rather that if a 5th volume commenced, it would be in a changed format, pointing out that his initial goal for the Garland had been to create a refuge for the fugitive flowers of literature which were scattered in the wind. He was content that he had accomplished this. He did acknowledge that he would be persuaded to continue the Garland if it were to make a profit. Again, he noted that during the 4 years of publishing the Garland, other similar publications had appeared, which he encouraged his readers to consider supporting. He concluded with a statement of gratitude. Since the Garland did not sell advertising space, it would have had to survive solely on its paying readership. It is no surprise this is not a task it could accomplish, and Gallaher would have known this from the start. There are several other factors that may likely have played into the decision to end the Garland. At the onset of his printing in Harper's Ferry, he had two partners, his brother Horatio and his nephew Robert Gallaher Jr. Within the first year, Robert passed, and no one seems to have replaced him. Once in Harper's Ferry, his wife Catherine, who had been raised in an urban environment, may have yearned for a creative outlet, and a women's magazine would have been ideal. Having read over the 208 issues produced, I am convinced there is no possible way two men in their late 20s would have been interested and willing to collect, edit, and produce this content for no profit. I suspect that Catherine played a vital role in this magazine. At some point, Horatio also married, and his wife may have had additional input. However, by 1828, with a growing family, Catherine may have had less time for literary endeavors. At the beginning of 1827, John was in the process of purchasing the Farmers' Repository, the Charlestown paper where he once worked. The sale was announced in the February 28, 1827 issue of the Repository. This was just 2 weeks after the date when Volume 4 of the Garland should have been published. The Repository was to be combined with the Virginia Free Press, a name change back in 1824, under the new name Virginia Free Press and Farmers' Repository, beginning with March 6, 1827. Although the initial issues of this newly combined paper were to be printed simultaneously at both Charlestown and Harper's Ferry print shops, John was in the process of moving his Harper's Ferry shop to Charlestown. There was no mention of a family move at this time, but most likely one occurred. These events, the small number of his staff, the possible loss of his wife's assistants, the negotiations and final purchase of an additional paper, the process of moving and combining two print shops, and the possibility of a family move would have all contributed to the decision to produce one less publication. The Virginia Free Press and Farmers' Repository would continue until 1832, when Gallaher would drop the second half of the name, simply returning to Virginia Free Press. Gallaher and his descendants and successors would continue the Free Press until 1916, for a total of 95 years. The decision to end the Garland may have led to an outpouring of unhappy customers, as the following week in the final issue of the Garland was this announcement: proposals will be issued shortly by a lady for the publication of a new series of the Garland with some improvements. I have found no such new series. Recognition for the Garland can be found in articles from surrounding area papers. As was customary, Gallaher sent copies to other publications for review. Having received and reviewed the first copy of the Garland, the March 4th, 1824 issue of the Martinsburg Gazette complimented it and encouraged the Gazette patrons to stop in their shop, review the Garland, and consider subscribing to it. The Friday, March 12, 1824 issue of the Fincastle Mirror from Fincastle, Virginia, acknowledged the receipt of issues, complimented the paper, and encouraged others to purchase it. Although Gallaher freely used materials from other publications, we know that he sought original works to publish. He was known to run contests and award prizes. The Saturday, November 11, 1826 issue of the Torchlight and Public Advertiser from Hagerstown, Maryland, reprinted one such prize-winning story. Why the Garland? My first thoughts on the meaning of the term was that of a crown or wreath of flowers usually worn on the head. But another definition of the term is that of a collection of short literary pieces, such as poems and ballads, an anthology, or a literary miscellany. This second definition aptly describes the lady's Garland. Its content was frivolous, a mixture of melancholy sentimentalism and lightheartedness. Much of it was reprints from other publications, as Gallaher said, giving a second life to the many published items he and his staff came across in their readings. Published almost 200 years ago, and probably not intended to be collected and archived, it is a difficult publication to find and review today. I would like to thank Jane Reisler and the Jefferson County Museum for the review of their collection of the Garland, the West Virginia and Regional History Center of the West Virginia University Libraries in Morgantown for their financial support of this project and the use of their collections. Mary Koger, a descendant of John Gallaher, for sharing with me her family's collection of the Ladies Garland and some family history. Wayne Goodrich for the use of his Albertus and Gallaher items. Keith Hammersola and the Martinsburg Library for the use of their Albertus family collection, and Shepherd University Library for their assistance in securing numerous items used in this research. The Ladies Garland is truly a gem in the casket of early American ephemera printing and a little-known treasure of the West Virginia printing history story. It is also an enduring Valentine. That is it. How do I end here? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dianne.
I hit stop share.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
just a reminder to everyone, thank you for a fascinating story, which I've been waiting to hear for 2 years.
Sorry.
And that if you would like to submit a question to Dr. Roman, you please use the chat function, but to give you all a moment to do that, I will pose the first question. Dr. Roman, how many original issues of the magazine still exist? And you did allude to several locations of them, but is there one place that they are all housed?
Oh, goodness, no. They're really, really difficult to find. I do have to say that our local Jefferson County Museum has probably the largest collection that I have encountered, except for Mary Koger, who was so wonderful. We connected on the internet, and she brought for me to see a complete bound, I think, volume 2, the entire thing in its nice leather binding. Most of them are scattered issues. The University of Virginia has a box called the West Virginia box, and they have scattered issues there. There's an issue here, an issue there. Wayne and Donna have an issue or two. They come up occasionally on auction. Even microfilm is hard to find. There are quite a number of places that have microfilm, but getting it they will not share it. It's one of the microfilm pieces that does not want to go around. And so you have to go there. American Antiquarian in Worcester has a full set. So, I mean, it's just difficult to find them. So I feel just totally honored that I have found and seen as many originals as I have had the chance to do and stuff. So does that help?
Yeah, that's
great little magazine. Everybody should go to the museum and look at it.
Thank you. And so we'll turn it over to the chat function with Teresa and Donna.
Okay.
Well, I'm asking a question right now. What did John Gallaher do later in life?
Well, he went on, I don't have all those notes in front of me. He went on as the House of Delegates. He was in that for several years. He actually stayed in newspapering. After the free press really is solidified, whether it's his son and other relatives taking over, he moves to Richmond. He moves around the Richmond area because, you know, the House of Delegates is in Richmond. He works with several different papers. He works with Mr. Pleasance. I'm trying to think of the name of that paper. I can't, you know, a lot of these, they're Whig papers, then they're small, you know, basically ephemera. They didn't last very long. He then went on to work in Washington, D.C., and he worked with money, and I'm trying to think what the actual title of his job was, but I can't think right now. But he had a wonderful career. He really did. And the Farmers Repository is actually, I think, the vehicle that did it. Everything, the Free Press and the Garland are local, some political, but buying the repository launched into his own kind of megaphone for his political campaigns and went on from there. So he stayed in printing, but he expanded into politics.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? No. All right. Well,
I don't see any,
anybody else? Did you see anything, Teresa?
not in
Well,
the
I see
chat.
we're-
I mean, if somebody is can't handle the chat, wants to ask a question, just unmute yourself
Yeah,
at the top right.
Anybody have any additional questions? Do you know where Mr. Willis's, oh, here's a couple, where Mr. Willis's print shop was located?
no, I have not found that in Harper's Ferry, but I know, and I don't know where the one in Charlestown was because when he moved there, but I know that it was totally destroyed during the Civil War.
Yeah, no, Mr. Willis in
Oh, Willis.
in-
Willis was
in
on Princess
Shepherdstown.
Street.
Do you know where on Princess Street?
I think down towards the river,
Oh, okay. Okay,
but I haven't found it. I've looked on old maps and I haven't found it yet.
all right. Okay. Let's see. Melinda Day from the National Park at Harper's Ferry has used the Virginia Free Press for the past 35 years to do her research. Do
Excellent.
you know what Gallaher did during the Civil War?
During the Civil War.
Mhm.
I don't know. I haven't done that much research on him afterwards. That he would have already been in the House of Delegates, whether he stayed in Richmond or by then if he was in DC, I don't know.
Okay. Okay, yeah, because the Civil War, by the time the Civil War came, of course, Virginia would, he would have either been in the Confederacy or
And
in
he passes away in 1777, I think it is.
1877.
Yeah, in 1877, and he is in DC working for several years before that. So him and his wife may have moved there more permanently from Richmond.
Okay, okay. All right. Other questions? Anybody else?
I saw where Nick said that it was $1.50 an issue,
Mhm.
which is true and stuff. I thank you for that. I didn't say that.
And it was interesting, if you look at it, that if you paid up front, it was one price. If you paid quarterly, it was another price. If you waited, if you
In the
paid-
history of printing, they all spent so much time, just like William says, pay up your bill. People have subscriptions and they don't pay them. Printing was a difficult business to get your money from.
Yes, that is true. I taught media history. And newspapers back in the 17 and 1800s were full of, please pay for your subscription advertisements. So, other questions? Well, we've got a lot of, thank you very much. This was very interesting comments. So that is quite wonderful.
Excellent.
Good, yes. Just want to remind everyone that our next speaker series event will be held on October 13th. And Austin and Carmen Slater will be talking about their renovation of the Christian Cly's home on New Street in Shepherdstown. And the title of their talk is Love Begins at Home. We don't know yet whether this is going to be Zoom, hybrid, or in person. My guess is that it's likely to be either Zoom or hybrid given COVID. But there will be press releases sent out. There will be notices on our Facebook page, and members will receive an email. Members and supporters will also receive an email about the event. So keep an eye out for that. Do we have anything else? Well, thank you so much, Diane. This was quite a lovely evening. We really appreciate it. And we're hopeful that all of you will join us at our next event. Remember, we have a YouTube channel, and if you missed the speaker series in the spring, those are available on our YouTube channel. Historic Shepherdstown Museum, I think is what it's called. I should know this off the top of my head. And Diane's talk, if you have any friends who might have been interested in it and were not able to join tonight, Diane's talk will also be available within the next few days. Our former student intern is going to be putting it up on YouTube for us. So thank you so much. And we are really pleased that you were able to do this for us, Dianne.
Thank you. It was great.
All right, great, wonderful. Okay, this is officially adjourned.
All right. Goodbye.
Okay, bye. Okay.